Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I actually have prepared a formal paper because it just saves me from being incoherent. So I will be reading, but about halfway through, maybe even sooner, I'm going to be playing about a 15-minute video. I felt that given that the title of my paper is When Words Fail, I ought to be able to admit that I don't have the words also to say some of the things that some of the meanings and messages that I really want to project today. And this video will do that very, very well for me. So, okay, so when I first entered into dialogue with translation studies as a discipline about 2 decades ago, there was an unquestioned split in the field between spoken and written translation, which struck me as curious. Coming from a theoretical perspective on language informed more by the social sciences and philosophy, it seemed to me that much of what was being discussed with regard to the translation of literature in particular, through the paradigms of post-colonialism, post-structuralism, and postmodernism, was differently but equally applicable to the spoken word. What I found was that translation studies taken as a whole had pretty much ignored the ethical domain of spoken interpreted encounters, except perhaps in its identification of individuals like La Malinche as iconic metaphors for colonialism. In the early 19th century, Schleiermacher's writings on translation had distinguished between art and scholarship associated with literature, and commerce, which he linked to the translation of the spoken word and technical translation. This split was maintained in the field of translation studies for quite some time and helped to sustain the view of interpreters and non-literary translators in particular as impartial and invisible channels between 2 linguistic systems. Literary translators were granted more freedom to establish a creative and experimental relationship between the signifier and the signified that was not tied to a strict representational view of language. The cultural turn encouraged translators to operate against their own constraints, including the constraint of fluency, and to see themselves as vehicles for dissent. The emphasis in post-colonial theory on contact zones, power relations, and the ideological over the aesthetic created an ethical function for literary translation that involved more than creating contact between languages and cultures. There was little in translation studies to suggest commonality between the activity of interpreters that took place in real-world situations and the translation of works of fiction, despite the stories, themes, and characters present in both. Yet many interpreters exclusively work in situations that require translating narratives of trauma, poverty, and violence, including in war zones. In both text types, whether real or imagined, strategic manipulation, webs of interlocution, cultural grids, and political agendas can become salient. The higher demand on interpreters and translators of nonfiction to remain impartial and objective, 2 words repeatedly found in codes of practice, can therefore be no more straightforward than it would be for translators of fictional texts, insofar as for all there is a presumption of faithful practice. Even abusive fidelity does not necessarily imply that any interpretation can count as valid or appropriate. All acts of translation, whether involving spoken, written, signed, acoustic, or visual language, are equally dialogic in nature. As Wittgenstein's notion of family resemblance suggests, there is no essential core in which the meaning of a sign is located and which is therefore common to all the uses of that sign. Words acquire meaning in interaction with others, not in isolation. When anyone uses language, there's no guarantee that they mean the same thing in using or choosing the same word. We are aided in our understanding of others' statements only by interpreting what they say or do based on our own understandings and expectations, formed at the time and through prior experiences. But to acknowledge semantic uncertainty as an aspect of all communication doesn't imply that confrontations of different beliefs or experiences will necessarily lead to misunderstanding or reinforce difference. Communication with others is generally aimed at arriving at an understanding about the content of an expressed point of view, aided by the specific context in which it is embedded. barring the explicit will to misunderstand. And there are, of course, many institutional and cultural contexts in which unwillingness to understand is evident and purposeful. In the context of asylum adjudication, an area in which I once worked as a translator and interpreter, and in the 2000s conducted extensive research, there are consistent patterns with respect to the arguments made for or against the credibility of an asylum claim. Immigration officials, particularly in the West, tend to assess applicants' claims of persecution using evaluative criteria embedded in ostensibly universal norms that are used to challenge the accounts of the applicants' experiences and subsequent actions, and invalidate the credibility of their claims. The stakes for applicants and their interpreters are therefore high, as every utterance in an asylum interview forms part of a wider narrative that must stand up to critical scrutiny within this biased framework. These proceedings also often require applicants to discuss very intimate details about what led them to flee, including instances of casual brutality, rape, or torture. Paradoxically, the repeated mentions of violent acts like these in multiple applicants' narratives within these institutions causes them to lose their power and significance and fail to adequately represent the profound emotions that lie behind them, making these unspeakable traumatic events unable to be adequately heard. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has insisted that the efficacy of speech derives not from language, but from the institutional conditions of its production and reception. For Bourdieu, the power of language is not invoked linguistically. Authority comes to language from the outside, hence the near impossibility of the emergence of discursive gaps that might challenge socially pre-established grounds of legitimate meanings and forms of expression. For Bourdieu, where an individual or group's language has no prior authorization, it cannot produce new forms of legitimacy. This would require a break with social conventions and modes of practice, both inscribed in language and embodied or enacted through dominant beliefs, practices, and institutions. Over the course of my research, in trying to make sense of the seeming void I have witnessed between words and structures of feeling in the context of asylum application, the inescapable struggle to find the right words and the failure of words to accomplish this task, it occurred to me that these attempts in translation had something in common with those visual artists who, in their desire to represent and express the human condition and human complexity, responded by moving beyond or between figurative and abstract painting. But rather than think about art and artists as only metaphors for the task of the translator, I'd like to consider what it might look like to expand the horizon of translation practice to include wider forms of symbolic expression. That is, to allow language in all its forms to serve as a better tool to capture the complex meanings specific to narratives of the migration experience, whatever form this takes. The literary translator and translation scholar Carol Mayer has written extensively about conflictive situations in which translators and interpreters find themselves, and the cognitive as well as emotional effects on them in their role as what she terms intervenient beings. That is, one who intervenes, but also comes in incidentally or extraneously, situated or occurring between different points or events. This concept catches the translator's own sense of being an acted upon actor, someone who has to make choices on a foundation which has already been established elsewhere. Mayer relates the story of one of her students, an experienced Chilean interpreter, who wrote about the shattering effect on her of an interpreting assignment involving a young abused mother who attempted suicide. Mayer writes, "She wrote about being haunted for a long time by the young woman and her situation. A mother herself, she could feel the other woman's pain, her helplessness. She realized that together they were trapped in the same system that has few real solutions to offer an abused woman. and that she herself was unprepared to handle the emotional aspects of interpreting, which left her feeling distraught, especially since, according to what she had learned, emotional involvement is a deterrent to the quality of the interpretation. I heard many stories of this kind in interviews I conducted with interpreters in the UK in the early 2000s as part of my research on their impact and influence across different stages and contexts of the asylum application process. Unlike Mayer's student, many of these interpreters, some refugees themselves, were undeterred from some form of intervention in performing their task. As one Iraqi interpreter who worked at the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture told me, I would do my best to be that person who's in the session with the clinician, and not just by speaking the language, but also by trying my best to feel his feelings and putting myself in the situation, being in this country, alone, nobody around. They are totally blind and deaf, and they need somebody who can represent them and convey the accurate message. Similar views are expressed by translators of fiction when speaking about their work. Nicholas Delange, the translator of several works of the Israeli writer Amos Oz, shares his memory of the first book he translated. He writes, "The first book that I translated has a female narrator living in Jerusalem in the 1950s and speaking Hebrew in her real life. I remember working very hard trying to find a voice for this young married woman. To pick up a character, a narrator from another book, from another language, and put them into your book in your language is very difficult, isn't it? I remember thinking, what sort of words does she use? Does she say wireless or radio? Does she say frock or dress? Little things which make an enormous difference to the way it reads." So I want to begin my consideration of the relationship between words, images, and the experiences of migrants attempting to tell their stories by examining the work of the New York-based African-American artist Jacob Lawrence, whose career began in the first half of the 20th century. With his migration series, Lawrence sought to chronicle the northward migration of African Americans, which began in 1915 and continued over decades, during which time over 6 million people headed to northern and western cities, fleeing the Jim Crow South, seeking the possibility of better opportunities. Both his parents were from Virginia and would later meet in Atlantic City, where Lawrence was born and spent his early childhood. And both had taken part in the migration and had shared stories with him. After living in Philadelphia for a while, around 1930, at the age of 13, Lawrence settled with his mother and siblings in Harlem. Born just over 100 years ago in September 1917, Jacob Lawrence is one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. He was the key artist in the closing years of the Harlem Renaissance, and in 1941, the first Black artist to be represented by a New York gallery while only 24 years of age. In that same year, 26 of his 60-panel migration series appeared in Fortune magazine, followed by an exhibit of the entire series at the prestigious Edith Halpern's Downtown Gallery. A year later, half of the paintings were bought by MoMA and the other half by the Phillips Collection in DC, with the galleries agreeing to take alternate panels so as not to break up the original narrative structure. Lawrence called the small pictures, painted in tempera on hardboard panels, The Migration of the Negro. The series opens with an image of a chaotic crowd in a train station. Oops, nope. Pushing toward 3 ticket windows marked Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. The important role these cities played was noted in Emmett Scott's 1920s book, Negro Migration During the War, one of the first scholarly books to note the magnitude and significance of the event. Along with other books, newspapers, pamphlets, and illustrated magazines, it constituted an important part of the extensive research Lawrence conducted at Harlem's branch of the New York Public Library before embarking on the series. The paintings were derived from this research and his notes, which were turned into captions with the help of his wife and fellow artist, Gwendolyn Knight. Once the panels were finished, they edited the captions to eliminate all but what they considered the essential information they wanted to convey. In 1993, for one of the few tours of the entire series, Lawrence changed its title from The Migration of the Negro to The Migration Series and rewrote the original 1941 captions. The caption accompanying the first panel originally read, "During the World War, there was a great migration north by Southern Negroes," and was later changed to, "During World War I, there was a great migration north by African Americans," reflecting the fact that there had been a Second World War since then and a change in racial self-designation. Images of train stations, waiting rooms, and railroad cars filled with people leaving, arriving, and acculturating into new environments recur throughout the series. These depictions of this process of increased fluency in new modes of living recall the anthropologist Tim Ingold's observation about the inseparability of locomotion and cognition. Knowledge, he suggests, is formed as humans move across the surface of the earth, not by collecting information from observations they make about this place or that, but from their own actions and lived experiences. The individual agency involved in the migrants' decisions is illustrated in many of the panels. There are also many, though, that speak directly to the social, economic, and ideological structures that shaped their decision to leave. The interweaving of image and text in the Migration series allows Lawrence to explore and reveal the multiple dimensions of the migration story he wanted to tell. The visual images are not and were not intended to be literal representations of what was expressed in the written historical accounts about events and emotions. According to his printmaker, Jacob and I would discuss color and how to arrange those colors in order to establish greater distance, space, and definition of subject. Shapes were first and foremost in our discussion. At the outset of our conversations, an arm was an arm, but as we reached a higher level and became more involved with the print, we made reference to the subject in an increasingly abstracted way. The arm would then be referred to as the shape on the right of the blue. The last panel of the series, captioned "And the Migrants Kept Coming," shows a crowd of faceless men, women, and children standing on one side of a train platform with their bags and suitcases, collectively adorned in different shades of red, green, blue, yellow, brown, black, and white. The art historian Richard J. Powell also notes in this painting the representation of style. He writes, "Like a medley of intermittent, brilliant colors springing from a new African-American quilt, Lawrence's indistinguishable masses bring an eye-catching palette and vibrancy to the otherwise monochromatic train station." Lawrence portrays these passengers as people in transition to a new state of mind and body, stepping hopefully into an uncertain future, making their own history. Mindful but undeterred by the certain knowledge that in their destinations to which they were headed, their struggle against discrimination and exploitation would continue. Although ultimately not wishing to become closely associated with the abstract movement of his day, the abstraction from the literal that Lawrence chose to employ through his blocks of vivid color and unindividuated faces and bodies was his bridge to commentary on the broader human level, a view without obstacles or restricted perspective, but with an immediacy of presence. Much of his work encodes an extensive dialogue between the figurative and the abstract. Though he acknowledged his affinity with social realism, he also maintained a certain distance from this form that dominated the art world during the Depression. Lawrence called his stylistic approach dynamic cubism, distinguishing it from the cubism of Braque and Picasso. There is an effective multimodality in his paintings that maintains the same communicative power across all his work. He was dedicated to shape and color, as suggested by this reported instruction Lawrence gave to his printmaker. He told him, "Imagine the red in two planes. The structural or outer area should be deeper than the interior. Make it deep enough that it looks still. The interior red will look more translucent after the glaze and will seem to go back in space. Can you do that?" The art critic David Sylvester once described this process, though not in relation to Lawrence, as a duet between painter and paint that was met and dealt with when it came along, and in which the painter's hope was that they would not impose their own will upon the situation, but collaborate in the emergence of something with a life of its own. This reflective semantic process, vividly portrayed in Lawrence's Request, is reminiscent of translators' attempts to get each shade of meaning exact against a background of alternate meanings. Words create for translators what color and form create for visual artists, structures of feeling. What Lawrence accomplished in his art that set him apart from the other artists of social themes was the element of movement and urgency that were formally achieved in his paintings. What the viewer catches is a moment that has just become and will change again any second. Lawrence attempts to convey this relationship in his heterolingual approach to his medium of communication, art, which allows him to give voice to and provoke in the viewer doubt or uncertainty, both strong emotional responses about the meaning of a painting. The dialogue he engaged in between the past and the current art movements of his day added an additional layer to this. But what is also evident in his approach to painting is his understanding of the experience of migration. His work reveals the different degrees of diffusion, appropriation, assimilation, resistance, and enduring ambivalence that all migrants undergo, and the importance of the lived environments in which new modes of perception connected to these experiences are negotiated, configured, and challenged. Lawrence was engaged in intersemiotic translation, carrying source texts, objects, and figures across sign systems, creating a dialogue between the signs and forms of representation. He created a unique art language, part figurative, part abstract, playing with elements of color, line, shape, tone, and texture. To interpret existing written accounts of the African American migration, to better reveal its complexities, to tell it as a visual artist who understood that words alone would not suffice. Conventionally, translators and interpreters tasked to translate similarly socially and emotionally complex events and accounts are limited to the tools from within the same semiotic system, words. One often perceives a quiet desperation in people's faces as they listen without comprehending to an interpreter retell their stories of trauma and displacement. So now I want to play a video. I'll just give you a little background to this film. The title of the film is Wellfounded Fear. I've shown it, some of you may have seen it because I've showed it in some of my classes. It basically was a documentary made, an amazing documentary. It's a pre-9/11 documentary, so it really it's still the INS and not ICE, right? So, and they got complete access to asylum interviews, to interviews with the asylum officials, some background on some of the asylum applicants that were willing to tell their story beyond just the filming of their hearing. And it's interesting because they don't ever talk about the translations. They never mention the interpreters. It's not part of the their story. So it's very interesting as someone who watches it, it is focused in on that, how much they've really left out, because I mean, I would say a number of things. The interpreting, the quality of the interpreting in many cases is very poor, which only represents the standards that the INS require, which is that you just bring somebody who can be an interpreter. They don't supply interpreters, and it also just shows you how bureaucratic the questions are. I worked in this area myself, you know, a long time ago, but they really are looking to find a way to look for discrepancies in the story. They put a lot of emphasis on facts that you know or don't know. They put a lot of emphasis on the remembrance of dates. So it's a perfect example, really, of how difficult it is for the words that are spoken to get even close to conveying the experiences that brought them to this place in the first place. So I found wonderfully, for the purposes of this talk, there is a director's cut now. Anyone can look at it it's on Vimeo. But I found that they had actually recut the story of this Chinese poet. So you'll see, because usually the stories, they're kind of interwoven. So there's a bit of him and then someone else comes along, but this is it in its entirety. And I want to play it for you. It's about 15 minutes long, but it will give you a real sense of what I've just described. The person who is the interviewer for him, I will just say, he was one of the kind of more thoughtful but many of them are very thoughtful. It's a wonderful film. You should really watch it because they're very honest about the cynicism that they develop when they hear the same story over and over again, as I mentioned earlier when I started off the talk. But they're also really, you know, trying to do the job that they're given, which is you have to exclude some and you can't include them all. But this guy in particular, I think, had some real. I think he ended up after the video was shot. He ended up leaving the service, and I think part of why he did that was because he realized, maybe through the telling of the documentary, I don't know, but it's a very hard job. It's very hard to do, and cynicism, I think, protects them in the end from just not feeling. But what happens is because they don't look for feelings, because they don't want to hear feelings, the very thing that would help them understand what actually these people in front of them have gone through is just missing, right? So this is a mix of the documentarians talking to the applicant, and then you'll also see the part where he actually is being interviewed by the official. So. Very good. Be here in a second.
我是瀑布的孤魂，一首永久离群所居的诗。我的漂泊的歌声是梦的由衷，我的唯一的听众是沉寂。
This is a very short poem.
那个时候呢，我就有问题出来了。
他们对你的
他们
诗的反应，
这个诗已经被人看见了，也就反映到所谓领导那里去了。他们觉得我和共产党开始唱反调，有反骨了。
So, the authority feel he's against the communists and he's become too liberal.
What did they tell him? To stop writing?
他们有没有禁止你写？
禁止不允许写，而且是呢有人监督你啊，但我还是偷偷的写。
I've read what he says in the application form itself, so I have an idea. Now I'm going to skim the 30-page affidavit. But to answer your question, look at the I-589 first. And then you delve into the other stuff as is your want. Then I call my wife and ask her what to do. She tells me on the phone without having seen the case.
How do you like getting this much documentation?
I like it for a number of reasons. Some of them good and some of them not so good. Usually, if there's this much documentation, it means that one of the NGOs that knows what they're doing has taken the case and has put a lot of research into it, and they don't take cases which are not good cases. So you know it's a substantive case if you've got this much paper. But yeah, I mean, when I see paper like this, you have two reactions. I smile internally, but to my colleagues, you've got to act like, oh my God, look at that, you know, because everybody has to put on a show. But
now, one of your colleagues said that he worries when he gets a big file of paper that it's when they can't impress you with brilliance, they dazzle you with bullshit, and that's what a pile of paper is.
Well, it depends on the pile. A pile of paper this big is not, in my experience, has never been frivolous. Now, if it's a pile of paper that big, it could very well be. After you get over this much, I've never known it to be frivolous. This is not frivolous. It can't be.
Yes.
Yeah.
但是我感觉这个人生就是这种宇宙生命现象，最后应该这个整个灵魂应该在哪里才能够栖息呢？我到美国纽约的第一个夜晚的最强烈的感觉是什么呢？逃避逃亡的感觉。那天晚上我睡觉已经睡着了，但是半夜的时候呢，感觉是整个那心里很压抑，透不出气来。我就好像是突然就醒了，醒了以后呢，就在我那屋子里走来走去，走来走去，就好像是什么呢？ 那个心里憋的什么气透不出来啊。后来呢，我转了半天了，突然就拿起笔来，我就开始写，好像通过那个里边的都压抑的东西啊，通过那个笔啊，就慢慢的就出来了。我就写了一首那个当天晚上的那个诗啊，就叫逃避逃亡。那么我已经逃亡，我为什么要逃避逃亡？那就说明逃亡并不是我的选择。反而就是呢，逃避逃亡是我生命的一种最本真的选择。我并不想逃亡，而是迫不得已的逃亡。这是我到美国的最大的一个感受。当天晚上第一个瞬间的那感受。
我的第一个感受就是，我一下了飞机就感觉就是怎么说，就感觉就是说，首先是一种自由感。我觉得这种从此以后没有一种危险的东西去追逐我们了。还有一种就是，还有一个最强烈的感觉，整个这个西半球啊，这么大的一个西半球，无边无际的西半球，就一个亲人了，就是只有这一个亲人跟我相依为命，然后就是以后人生的这个道路就靠我们2个人去走，这就是一种最强烈的感觉。对美国的感觉就是说，反正就是因为我在国内的时候一种朋友以前在国内的时候，他们说就是踏上美国的土地以后，就感觉就是连空气都是自由的，这个感觉我是很强烈。我确实感觉在美国的确实这种自由是真的是连空气都是自由的。
进入角色啊。
Mr. Wong lives in Queens. Is that
看医生那个检查呢，我以为是去检查身体，所以也就比较轻松自如去。但到了那里以后，他并不检查我的身体，他要检查我身上所有的那个地方，哪些地方留下了伤痕。结果呢，后来本来这些事情都已经淡忘了，因为它已经是随着时间的消失啊，已经不存在了。 突然这一检查，我心里面很难过。我真的将来就感觉我作为一个诗人，不仅精神上受到一种践踏，我几乎整个身体遍体鳞伤。那医生都简直不敢相信我曾经遭受过这种命运，那是文化革命的周期。 他发现了胸口的那个伤口，看到我那个手被打断的那个骨头，我的手掌被撕裂，还有我的脚血管都断了。如果当时不缝针，或者我的血液流尽以后，我整个生命都不存在，我就死了。还有我的牙齿。我不敢维护我的过去，不敢。
历史提起他要说要检查一下，叫医生练一下这些东西。他以前都把他都想的都忘掉了呢，那就说没有想到起这些东西，是因为他已经在身上留下伤疤了，已经没有想到怎么再去回顾它。
就是那个时候，我的高墙那个电网里边，谁也没想到王宇。我那个时候最大的感受是怀念我的爱情，我不断的给他写诗。 在内心里边不断的跟他倾诉，人家说你作为一个那个囚犯，你为什么在监狱里面还有那么一种感情呢？就像我监狱里面作为一个囚犯，我最大的感情就是对人类的一种美好的一种值得珍贵的感情的一种怀念，所以我在这里面写了很多诗献给我的爱人。如果我这一生没有他，我早不存在了，因为我基本上如果他们不出版我的作品。 我就没有生存的能力，就是他救了我，而且救了我的整个全部的创作，我的精神生命。
Well, my reaction is I am humbled. What a life. And
What you seem shocked? What was particularly?
oh, it's just when you read something like that, you just remember how weighty our job is here. I mean, have you read that file? Yeah, it's pretty impressive, I think. So often after I've done this for a couple of years now, and you come to work and things are in your mind, or, I hope I get easy cases, all this stuff. And then you read somebody's file like that and you remember just really how important what we do is. My job, I think, is to establish as best I can that the man is who he says he is. And if I do that, if I satisfy myself that he is who he says he is, then I think he gets asylum.
Zhang Wang. Zhang Wang.
Is this for you?
Yes.
You have an interpreter or a lawyer?
I haven't.
You have what?
I haven't interpreter.
Where is it?
This outside.
Okay, you need to hold on to this until everyone is here. Yeah, interpreting?
Sir, could I ask you to raise your right hand, please?
你右手举起来宣誓。
Do you promise to tell the truth during our talk?
Yes.
就是你要告诉他你的真实情况。
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Did you ever know the name of the person who told your grandpa of your father's death?
他说：“你知不知道这个人的名？谁告诉你的祖父的？”
那个我就不知道了，我指着祖父，因为最后我父亲那个最后来个信，以后就没有信了，后来就那个监狱啊，来通知到我的家里边，我祖父就知道我父亲死了，后来呢搞我的专案的时候，他知道是秘密枪杀的。
He said he didn't know the particular name.
Sir, why didn't you stay in the United States when you were here in 1993?
他说：“问你，就是你那一次来，你为什么又回中国去了，而没有留在美国？”
我那是来，因为中国放我的时候，他是为了什么？奥运会，奥运会就是为了他树立国际的良好形象。我以为我回去的话不会有问题，我不会想到他们还会继续迫害我，把我又关进监狱里边去，所以我就回去了。我是希望我的痛苦的命运能够得到那个美国政府的关怀。 给我得到一种自由的那个庇护。
Young, H-U-A-N-G, window 2, please.
Can you let her know that no decision was made on her case? So the case is still pending with the service. But she has been referred to an immigration judge for further consideration. Okay, the judge also made the final determination on her application.
Hello. Okay, hi. Hi, good afternoon. Who's the principal applicant?
This one.
Do you have ID, sir? ID, please. Thank you. Here you go, sir. Thank you. The service is recommending that the case be approved, so congratulations to you.
已经通过了。
哦，上课。
Hi, you're welcome.
I am humbled. What a life.
is over.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Okay. Continue. So the contrast between the structures of feeling captured by the filmmakers and their complete absence in the bureaucratic exchange of questions and answers that occurs in the asylum interview could not be starker. In the case of this Chinese poet, there was a mountain of corroborating evidence. And in the vast majority of asylum cases, there is very little. And letters of torture provided by doctors are routinely ignored, and few have the involvement of NGOs or influential individuals. Having witnessed in my research the failure of words in such official contexts has convinced me that it is time to consider an expanded role for intersemiotic translation as an important step toward recognizing both the multiple forms in which narrative content can be framed and the potential of alternative semiotic systems to help mitigate and challenge the biases and preconceptions that often words alone cannot. To illustrate this point, I'd like to present a few examples of how migrants themselves have expressed the experience of being held in long-term detention through visual means, and in the process have created the kinds of newly constituted discursive spaces referenced by Bourdieu, in which alternative modes of perception can be constructed and contemplated. What we see in these examples are powerful direct expressions of and responses to an acutely felt politics of marginalization and exclusion. First example is of poems inked or carved into the walls of the detention barracks at Angel Island, a lesser-known prison-like detention center established off the coast of San Francisco in the late 19th century, sometimes referred to as the Ellis Island of the West, though the experiences of many of the mostly East Asian immigrants were radically different from most of those landing in New York, occurring as they did under the shadow of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The emotional impact of their experiences is confirmed in oral histories of Chinese immigrants and in the poems they left behind, only discovered in 1970 by a park ranger. 135 calligraphic poems survived. In addition to poems, drawings of birds, fish, horses, ships, and flags were also carved into the walls, the only signs of life during long periods of detention seen outside the windows or on brief outdoor breaks. Taken together, they express the isolation, despair, and anger that resulted from prolonged confinement or imminent deportation. This isn't a translation of this in case anyone's reading the Chinese. This is just one of the poems that has been translated. I think I won't read it, I'll just let you read it. So other equally powerful artistic expressions have emerged from more recent refugee and asylum seekers held in makeshift detention centers across the globe in the form of paintings done by artists during long periods of confinement in Australian detention centers, like that constructed on Nauru Island. The paintings capture their means and the means and motivations for seeking asylum and the prolonged effects of waiting in a state of virtual incarceration for an outcome regarding their cases. In the Villawood Detention Center, located outside Sydney, an innovative technique known as coffee painting was initiated by an Iraqi detainee held there. With no access to paints, he started using instant coffee powder diluted in water. He passed the technique to a fellow artist, Alwi Fado, who would spend over 5 years in Villawood before being released. Coffee painting gained a life of its own inside this and other centers, becoming something of a tradition amongst artist detainees. The Villawood paintings initially came to the attention of the public through the Refugee Art Project, conceived of in 2010 by a collective of academics and artists concerned with the hundreds of asylum seekers, including some for whom refugee status had already been granted, who continued to be detained indefinitely. Since its inception, more than 500 artworks have been exhibited to the Australian public and become available for sale on their website, with all the proceeds going back to the artists. So the question remains, by what means can translators and interpreters have a more direct impact on the creation of the kinds of discursive spaces in which words are not the only tool permitted? I don't claim to have an answer to this question, but one starting point might be an expanded agreement over what counts as instruments of interhuman understanding. In much of the work I've discussed here, we've already seen the innovative representation of the unutterable. There is a challenge, therefore, for translators and the translated to experiment with the legitimate bounds of communicative practice in order to better promote the expansion of ethical understanding. The fact that these drawings have achieved some legitimacy of acceptance by the International Criminal Court is proof that communicative innovations are both possible and powerful, and can be included within what the philosopher Paul Ricoeur has termed linguistic hospitality, or the willingness to reside in more than one language and play host to another's culture, an ethical as well as a communicative task, requiring both responsibility and sympathy for listening to and interpreting others' stories. Linguistic hospitality, according to Ricoeur, is grounded in a commitment to the belief in the translatability of all languages, and must be a core component of any cosmopolitan effort. Interpreters and translators play a major role in helping to implement this substantive core of cosmopolitanism. They facilitate types of encounters and exchanges that are distinct from the translations that occur more organically between individuals and groups in multicultural and multilingual encounters without recourse to mediation. They serve the important additional function of protecting the social, linguistic, and legal rights of individuals and communities, particularly where a clear bias, injustice, or imbalance of power reveals itself. In these instances, they are called upon not only to clarify linguistic or cultural issues, but to help ensure that all parties' interests and points of view are adequately understood. Revoicing a refugee or asylum seeker's motivation to flee famine, war, or persecution often requires more than linguistic or cultural skills, as deliberations regarding whether universal hospitality should be denied or granted are habitually fused with social, political, and discursive instruments of power. To produce workable mutual interpretations, translators and interpreters, like all language users, participate in the world as communicating agents in contexts that may foster ambiguity, doubt, contradiction, or misunderstanding. In situations where evidence of some form of trauma is present, discarding and clarifying meanings can be a particularly daunting task. There is an added obligation to minimize disrespect, humiliation, or mistrust between individuals, while maximizing the possibility that communicative objectives are met. There are no guarantees that interpreters or translators will evaluate accurately what is at stake in the communication, just as there is no certainty that their judgments will produce a positive outcome. Fallibility is part of and must be written into our understandings of the socially constituted ethical spaces translators and interpreters inhabit. The greater their visibility within these spaces, the more that is revealed about the ethical imperative inherent in this role. To minimize misrecognition and to find the best way, not only the best words, to represent the meanings expressed, while at the same time, as Carol Mayer suggests, altering the surface in ways that have more than superficial impact. Thank you.